The champagne flute in my hand was baccarat crystal, and I knew this because I'd spent the last 3 years of law school cataloging every detail that separated people like the Wagners from people like me. Not with envy, with precision. When you're building a career in corporate law, you learn to read power through objects, the weight of paper stock, the grain of leather portfolios, the particular way expensive glass caught light without showing fingerprints. This glass was showing my fingerprints. My palms were sweating. The Wagner family birthday celebration filled the grand ballroom of the Hoffman estate like a living, breathing demonstration of influence. 200 guests in designer evening wear, an orchestra that probably cost more than my annual salary, ice sculptures that would melt into irrelevance by midnight. I'd been to firm galas before, venues that approximated this level of wealth, but this was different. This wasn't corporate money trying to look elegant. This was old power that didn't need to try. I smoothed the burgundy silk of my dress, a strategic purchase, expensive enough to belong but modest enough not to draw attention. My role tonight was simple. Attend as Christian Wagner's date, smile appropriately at his family's celebration, and absolutely do not think about the fact that I was 24 years old and dating a man whose family controlled half the city's commercial real estate through methods my legal training suggested I shouldn't examine too closely. Relax, Astrid. Christian's hand found the small of my back, his touch proprietary in a way that had started feeling less like affection and more like display. You look beautiful. My family will adore you. I smiled, the professional expression I'd perfected in countless client meetings. I'm perfectly relaxed. Lie. My heart was performing a percussion solo against my ribs, and the rational part of my brain, the part that had graduated top of my class, that had built a reputation for being unshakable in depositions, was cataloging every exit with the same precision I used to analyze contracts. The ballroom was a study in controlled opulence, marble floors that reflected the chandeliers above, creating the illusion of standing between two mirror worlds. Dark wood paneling that absorbed sound, making even this crowd seem hushed, conspiratorial. The air smelled of expensive cologne, fresh lilies from arrangements that probably required a dedicated florist team and something else. Power, maybe, or just the particular scent of old money and older secrets. Christian guided me through the crowd with the ease of someone who'd been navigating these social waters since birth. 29 years old, handsome in the way of men who'd never questioned their place in the world. He wore his tailored tuxedo like a second skin. We'd been dating for 3 months, ever since he'd walked into Morrison & Associates requesting representation for a property acquisition that had seemed straightforward until I'd started reviewing the documentation. I'd noticed discrepancies. Small ones, the kind most junior associates would miss or ignore. Christian had noticed me noticing, and what should have been a professional concern had somehow transformed into dinner invitations, then exclusive events, then this, standing in his family's stronghold, wearing his casual touch like a claim. There's my father. Christian's voice carried a note I'd learned to recognize, the subtle tension that appeared whenever he mentioned the family patriarch. Come, I'll introduce you. We wove through clusters of guests, and I used the movement to observe. Legal training had taught me to read rooms, to identify hierarchies through body language and spatial positioning. Here, the hierarchy was clear. An invisible circle of deference surrounded certain individuals, guests unconsciously creating space, angling their bodies in subtle acknowledgement of presence and power. An older man in an immaculate charcoal suit held court near the orchestra, his silver hair and commanding posture marking him as someone accustomed to attention. Otto Wagner, the family's public face, whose name appeared on charitable foundations and legitimate business ventures. Beside him stood a woman in emerald silk, Andrea Wagner, whose smile never quite reached her calculating eyes. But it was the man standing slightly apart from the central gathering who made my breath catch. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with dark hair styled back in a way that should have looked conventional, but instead emphasized the sharp angles of his face. Strong jaw, straight nose, the kind of bone structure that belonged on classical sculptures. He wore a black tuxedo with a white shirt, the top 3 buttons undone in studied casualness that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. And he was watching me. Not obviously. His gaze swept the room with the lazy attention of a predator absolutely certain of his dominance. But when it landed on me, something shifted. Recognition flickered in eyes that were dark and intense. Not brown, something deeper, almost black in the ballroom's golden lighting. I felt it like a physical touch, a heat that started at the base of my spine and spread upward, making the silk of my dress feel suddenly too close to my skin. "Astrid?" Christian's voice pulled me back. "Are you all right?" "Yes." I forced my attention away from the stranger, back to the man whose arm I held. Just taking it all in. It's quite impressive. Christian smiled, pleased, and continued our trajectory toward his parents. I followed, conscious of that dark gaze tracking our movement across the floor. Whoever he was, he didn't look away, didn't pretend interest in conversation or champagne or anything else in this carefully orchestrated evening. He just watched. The introductions to Christian's parents were exactly what I'd expected. Polite interest from Otto, sharper assessment from Andrea, questions about my work at Morrison and Associates that felt more like an interview than small talk. I answered with the same diplomatic precision I used in client meetings, revealing enough to seem open while protecting the parts of myself that mattered. Through it all, I felt that dark attention like a brand between my shoulder blades. "You must meet my brother," Christian said suddenly, his hand tightening on my waist in a way that made me wonder if he'd noticed the stranger's scrutiny. "Eric's around here somewhere. He'll want to meet you." Eric. The name dropped into my consciousness like a stone into still water, creating ripples of recognition. I'd heard it before, whispered in the firm's corridors with a mixture of fear and fascination. Eric Wagner, the family's shadow power, the one who handled the business that never appeared in public records. "Actually, darling, Eric is..." Andrea started, but the orchestra had shifted tempo, striking up something classical and sweeping that made several couples drift toward the dance floor. "Dance with me," Christian said, not quite a question. I let him lead me onto the polished marble, his hand settling at my waist as we fell into the rhythm. He was a competent dancer, clearly well-trained, but there was something mechanical about it. Like he was performing the steps rather than feeling the music. Around us, other couples swayed and turned. The chandeliers above cast moving shadows, and the ice sculptures were already beginning to weep in the ballroom's warmth. Christian pulled me closer, and I forced myself to relax into his embrace, to ignore the feeling of being observed. "You're tense," he murmured against my ear. "Just nervous about making a good impression." "You're making an excellent impression." His smile was satisfied, proprietary. "My parents are already discussing how suitable you are." The words should have been flattering. Instead, they felt like a contract I hadn't signed being executed on my behalf. The song built toward its crescendo, strings and woodwinds creating something beautiful and slightly melancholic. I let the music carry me, let my mind drift from the pressure of Christian's expectations and Andrea's calculating assessment, and the strange tension that had been building since we'd arrived. A hand touched my shoulder. I turned, expecting another guest, perhaps someone wanting to cut in or introduce themselves to Christian's new companion. Instead, I found myself looking up into the darkest eyes I'd ever seen, set in a face that was all sharp angles and controlled intensity. It was the man who'd been watching me. Up close, he was even more striking, and even more dangerous. The top 3 buttons of his shirt revealed the hollow of his throat, the strong column of his neck. He smelled of sandalwood and something darker, richer, indefinably masculine. "May I?" His voice was low, accented with something I couldn't place. Not quite Italian, but close. Mediterranean, perhaps. I opened my mouth to respond, to politely decline, to remember that I was here with Christian and that cutting in on someone's dance partner was wrong, brother, Bella. The words hit me like cold water. Wrong brother. The realization crashed through my champagne-hazed awareness. I'd been dancing with Christian, but my hand had reached for someone else's shoulder. This man's shoulder. Eric Wagner. The Don himself had just caught me mid-mistake, and instead of looking offended or amused, he looked pleased. Like I'd just done exactly what he'd been waiting for me to do. My voice came out breathless, unsteady in a way that made me furious with myself. I was Astrid Klein, top of my class, unshakable in depositions, and here I was stammering like a teenager at her first dance. Astrid is my date, brother. Christian's voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. Not quite anger, something sharper. Territorial. So I see. Eric's gaze never left my face. But your date appears to have excellent instincts. She reached for the right brother. The arrogance in that statement should have offended me. Should have made me step back, apologize for the confusion, return to Christian's safe, predictable embrace. Instead, something in me, some part I didn't recognize, didn't want to acknowledge, responded to the challenge in Eric's dark eyes. I made a mistake, I said, proud that my voice came out level despite my racing heart. The lighting in here creates shadows. I apologize for the confusion. Do you? His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Apologize, that is. You don't look particularly sorry, Astrid Klein. He knew my name. Of course he knew my name. Eric Wagner probably knew everything about everyone in this ballroom, had files and dossiers and assessments that went far deeper than my resume at Morrison & Associates. I should return to my date. I took a deliberate step back, creating distance between myself and the magnetic pull of this man who'd appeared in my space like inevitability made flesh. Yes, you should. But he didn't move, didn't release me from the weight of his attention. Though I suspect you'll find yourself making the same mistake again. Some things are simply inevitable, Bella. The endearment should have annoyed me. Instead, it sent heat curling low in my stomach, a response I absolutely refused to examine. Christian's hand found my elbow, pulling me back into his orbit with more force than necessary. If you'll excuse us, Eric. Of course. Eric stepped aside with fluid grace, but his eyes tracked me as Christian led me away from the dance floor, away from the man who just turned a simple evening into something infinitely more complicated. We didn't speak until we'd reached the terrace doors. Christian pushed them open, and cool October air rushed in, cutting through the ballroom's stuffy warmth. I breathed deeply, trying to clear my head of sandalwood and dark eyes, and the feeling that I'd just stood at the edge of something dangerous. That was my brother, Eric, Christian said unnecessarily. His jaw was tight, his usual easy charm replaced by something harder. The family's troubleshooter. I gathered. I leaned against the stone balustrade, looking out over the estate's manicured gardens. Lanterns hung from trees, casting pools of golden light across pathways designed for romantic strolls and whispered confidences. He has a tendency to take things that don't belong to him. The bitterness in Christian's voice was new, revealing. But you're mine, Astrid. He needs to understand that. The possessiveness in those words should have been flattering. Instead, it felt like a cage closing, like I'd somehow become a pawn in a game between brothers I didn't fully understand. I'm not a thing to be taken, Christian. I kept my voice gentle but firm, the same tone I used when redirecting difficult clients. I'm a person who makes her own choices. Of course. He softened immediately, reaching for my hand. I didn't mean it like that. It's just... Eric has this effect on people, women especially. He takes what he wants, and he doesn't care who he hurts in the process. I thought about those dark eyes, the arrogant certainty in Eric's voice when he'd called me Bella, the way my body had responded despite every rational objection my mind had raised. "I'm not interested in your brother," I lied, the words tasting false even as I spoke them. "I'm here with you." Christian's relief was palpable. He pulled me close, kissing me with an intensity that felt more like claiming than affection. I kissed him back, trying to feel something beyond the pleasant warmth of companionship, trying to ignore the traitorous part of my brain that was comparing this kiss to the weight of Eric's gaze. When we pulled apart, I saw movement in the shadows beyond the terrace, a figure in a black tuxedo, watching from the darkness with predatory patience. Eric Wagner wasn't done with me. And the terrifying part, the part I couldn't acknowledge, couldn't accept, was that I wasn't sure I wanted him to be. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. But I felt Eric's presence like a compass point, always knowing exactly where he stood in the room. He didn't approach again, didn't try to cut in on another dance or manufacture another encounter. He didn't have to. We both knew something had shifted in that moment on the dance floor. Something inevitable, dangerous, and absolutely impossible to ignore. When Christian finally drove me home at midnight, I sat in the passenger seat of his Mercedes and stared out at the city lights, wondering what I'd just stepped into, wondering if that touch on Eric's shoulder had been a mistake or the most honest thing I'd done in months, wondering why wrong had never felt so dangerously right. The Monday morning after the Wagner birthday celebration, I arrived at Morrison & Associates to find a dozen white roses on my desk. No card, no signature, just perfect blooms arranged in a crystal vase that was probably worth more than my monthly rent. Karen Schmidt, my closest friend at the firm and the paralegal who kept my professional life from descending into chaos, appeared in my doorway with raised eyebrows and a knowing smile. "Secret admirer?" she asked, her German accent making the question sound more like an accusation. "Christian, probably." I touched one of the petals, noting the specific variety. Not standard florist roses, but garden roses, the kind that required specialized cultivation and cost 10 times as much. "He's been attentive since the party." "Attentive is good." Karen moved into my office, closing the door behind her with the deliberate care that meant she wanted to talk about something other than flowers. "Christian Wagner is a good match for you, Astrid. Stable, successful, from the right kind of family." The right kind of family. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with everything we both understood, but never explicitly discussed. The Wagners were clients, which meant their methods were none of our concern. The firm had built its reputation on representing people whose wealth came with questions we were paid not to ask. "He is stable," I agreed, settling into my desk chair and pulling up the day's schedule. "Which is exactly what I need right now." What I didn't say, stable felt increasingly like settling, like choosing the safe path because the alternative was terrifying. My phone buzzed. A text from Christian. "Did you like the roses? Thinking of you." "Dinner tonight?" I typed back. "Beautiful. Yes to dinner." 7? His response came immediately. "Perfect. I'll pick you up." Professional, warm, exactly what a relationship should feel like 3 months in. So why did I keep thinking about dark eyes and the arrogant curve of Eric Wagner's mouth when he'd called me Bella? The morning dissolved into the familiar rhythm of contract reviews and client calls. I'd been assigned to the Schneider merger, a complex acquisition that required sorting through months of financial documentation to ensure everything was above board. The kind of work I excelled at, finding patterns in numbers, identifying discrepancies, building cases from evidence. At 11 a.m., my phone rang. Extension from the front desk. "Ms. Klein, there's a delivery for you. Should I send it up? Another delivery. Christian was really laying it on thick. Yes, thank you. 5 minutes later, the receptionist appeared with a black box tied with burgundy ribbon. Not flowers this time. The box was flat, rectangular, expensive-looking in the way that suggested jewelry or high-end accessories. Karen, who'd returned with coffee, whistled low. Someone's pulling out all the stops. I untied the ribbon with careful fingers, lifting the lid to reveal tissue paper, and beneath it, a leather portfolio. Not just any portfolio. I recognized the grain immediately. Hermes, the kind of thing senior partners carried, not 24-year-old junior associates. Tucked inside was a single card in heavy cream stock. No printed logo, just a handwritten note in dark ink. For cataloging power, you'll need better tools. E.W. My hands went cold. E.W. Eric Wagner. What is it? Karen leaned closer, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she read the card. Astrid. That's from Christian's brother, isn't it? I closed the box quickly, my mind racing through implications. This wasn't a romantic gesture. This was something else entirely. A demonstration that Eric had been paying attention, that he'd heard my comment about cataloging power through objects, that he'd chosen this specific gift with deliberate precision. I met him briefly at the party, I said, aiming for casual and landing somewhere near defensive. He's just being welcoming. Family gesture. Eric Wagner doesn't make family gestures. Karen's voice dropped to a whisper, even though my office door was closed. Astrid, everyone knows about him. He's dangerous. Not in the way Christian is connected, but still respectable. Eric is different. Different how? She hesitated, weighing professional discretion against friendship. Let's just say the cases that never make it to official filing. The problems that solve themselves before litigation begins. The competitors who suddenly decide to sell at significant losses. That's Eric's domain. He's the family's real power. Christian handles the public face. Eric handles everything else. A knock on my door interrupted whatever response I might have given. Andreas Becker, one of the senior associates who'd been assigned as my unofficial mentor, stuck his head in. Astrid, got a minute? We need to discuss the Schneider merger findings. Of course. I stood, grateful for the interruption, and followed Andreas to the conference room where we'd been conducting the merger review. The next 3 hours disappeared into the focused work I actually loved. Parsing through financial statements, comparing projections against historical performance, identifying the small inconsistencies that could indicate larger problems. By 2 p.m., I'd found something concerning. A pattern of offshore transfers that didn't quite match the disclosed asset schedule. This could be nothing, Andreas said, reviewing my notes with the critical eye that had made him one of the firm's most valuable litigators. Or it could be very something. Good catch, Klein. We'll need to request additional documentation from Schneider's team. I nodded, making notes about the follow-up questions we'd need to address. This was why I'd gone to law school, why I'd sacrificed sleep and social life, and every other version of normal that my college friends had enjoyed. The intellectual challenge of finding truth buried in numbers and legalese. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Christian. Change of plans for tonight. Family dinner at the estate. Eric specifically asked that you join us. 7:30? My stomach dropped. Eric specifically asked. Not Christian inviting me to meet more of his family. Eric requesting my presence like I was a business meeting he needed to conduct. I stared at the message, knowing I should decline, should establish boundaries, should remember that I was dating Christian, and whatever had happened on that dance floor was a mistake to be forgotten, not explored. Instead, I typed, I'll be there. Andreas noticed my distraction. Everything all right? Fine, just personal plans shifting. I set my phone face down on the conference table, trying to refocus on the Schneider documents. But the rest of the afternoon felt like counting down to something inevitable. At 6 p.m., I left the office and went home to change. My apartment was a modest one-bedroom in a building that had probably been elegant in the 1940s, but now just felt tired. The rent was manageable on a junior associate's salary, and the location put me within walking distance of a decent coffee shop and a subway stop that made my commute bearable. I stood in front of my closet, staring at the limited options. The burgundy dress from Saturday felt too obvious, like trying to recreate a moment that shouldn't be recreated. I settled on a navy sheath dress that was professional enough for a business dinner, but elegant enough for the Wagner estate. Karen called as I was applying minimal makeup. "Are you seriously going to this dinner?" Her disapproval carried clearly through the phone. "Christian invited me. It would be rude to decline." "Christian didn't invite you. His dangerous older brother requested your presence, and you're walking right into whatever game he's playing." "I can handle myself, Karen." "Can you?" She paused. "Because from where I'm standing, you're a brilliant lawyer who's never had someone like Eric Wagner decide to pay attention to you. And men like him don't send Hermes portfolios as casual gestures." She was right, of course. Everything Karen said was absolutely rationally correct. Eric Wagner was dangerous. This dinner was a terrible idea. I should cancel. Establish clear boundaries. Remember that I was building something stable with Christian. But when Christian's Mercedes pulled up at 7 p.m., I was waiting outside my building, navy dress and minimal jewelry, and the traitorous anticipation I refused to acknowledge. The drive to the Wagner estate felt longer than Saturday night. The silence between Christian and me waited with things unsaid. He kept one hand on my knee, possessive and tense, and I noticed the tightness in his jaw that suggested whatever family dinner we were attending, he wasn't happy about it. "Eric's been asking about you," he said finally, as we turned onto the tree-lined drive leading to the estate. "Since Saturday. He wanted to know how we met, how long we've been together, what kind of law you practice." That's natural curiosity about his brother's girlfriend. Nothing about Eric is natural. Christian's hand tightened on my knee. "Just be careful tonight, Astrid. He has a way of making people think they want things they definitely don't want." The estate looked different at night, less overwhelming than it had during the party. We parked in front of the main house, and Christian helped me out of the car with careful courtesy that felt increasingly performative. Inside, a member of the house staff directed us to a smaller dining room I hadn't seen during the birthday celebration. The space was intimate, a table set for 6, candles already lit, the warm glow creating shadows that softened the formal elegance of the surroundings. Otto and Andrea Wagner were already seated, along with an older man I recognized as Otto Hoffmann, a longtime family advisor. And at the head of the table, in a black suit with his white shirt unbuttoned just enough to be deliberately casual, sat Eric. He stood when we entered, his dark eyes finding mine immediately. "Astrid, how lovely you could join us. Thank you for the invitation." I kept my voice professionally pleasant, the same tone I'd use for any business dinner. "And for the gift. It was unnecessarily generous." "I disagree." He moved around the table with that fluid grace I was beginning to recognize as characteristic. Quality tools are never unnecessary for someone who does important work. Christian's hand found my back, guiding me to the chair across from Eric. The seating arrangement felt deliberate, forcing me to look directly at Eric throughout the meal, unable to avoid those intense dark eyes. Dinner service began immediately. Courses that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Wine that came from bottles without price tags, because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. The conversation flowed around topics designed to be simultaneously personal and revealing. My work at Morrison & Associates, my background, my family. I answered with practiced deflection, revealing enough to seem open while protecting the parts that mattered. My father had been a factory foreman, my mother a nurse. They'd both died in a car accident when I was 19, leaving me with insurance money that had paid for law school and a determination to build something stable and secure. Ambition born from loss. Eric observed, his accent making the words sound more intimate than they should. That's the most dangerous kind. And dangerous to whom? I met his gaze directly, refusing to be the one who looked away first. To anyone who underestimates you. His smile was sharp, appreciative, which I suspect many people do. They see a pretty young associate and they miss the steel underneath. Eric. Otto's voice carried warning. Perhaps we should discuss more appropriate dinner topics. What could be more appropriate than getting to know Christian's companion? But Eric shifted his attention to his brother with predatory focus. You've chosen well, little brother. Astrid is exceptional. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Christian's fork clinked against his plate with more force than necessary. I'm glad you approve, he said tightly, since Astrid and I are building something serious. Are you? Eric's gaze returned to me. Building something serious? The question wasn't meant for Christian. It was meant for me, and everyone at the table knew it. Christian and I have been seeing each other for 3 months, I said carefully. We're taking things at a reasonable pace. Reasonable. Eric tasted the word like wine. How terribly sensible. And tell me, Astrid, do you always do the reasonable thing? Or do you sometimes surprise yourself? Heat flooded my cheeks, and I hated my body for responding to what was clearly calculated provocation. I find that reasonable choices tend to lead to better long-term outcomes. Safer outcomes, certainly. He leaned back in his chair, and I noticed Andrea watching the exchange with sharp interest. But not necessarily better. Sometimes the unreasonable choice is the one that changes everything. Otto cleared his throat loudly. Eric, enough. This is a family dinner, not a philosophy seminar. You're right, of course. Eric raised his wineglass in a mock toast. To family, and to the choices we make that bind us to people who either elevate us or diminish us. Christian's hand found mine under the table, squeezing hard enough to be uncomfortable. I squeezed back, offering reassurance I didn't entirely feel. The rest of dinner passed in stilted conversation, everyone carefully avoiding the tension that Eric had deliberately created. By the time dessert arrived, something elaborate involving chocolate and gold leaf, I was counting minutes until I could politely excuse myself. But Eric wasn't finished. Astrid, would you walk with me in the garden before you leave? He stood, extending a hand like it was the most natural request in the world. There's something I'd like to discuss regarding your work at Morrison & Associates. That's not necessary, Christian said quickly. Whatever business you have, you can... I'd like to speak with Astrid directly. Eric's voice went flat, the easy charm disappearing to reveal something harder underneath. Unless you're suggesting she's incapable of having a professional conversation without your supervision? It was a trap, beautifully constructed. If Christian objected, he looked controlling. If I refused, I looked weak. And Eric knew it, standing there with patient certainty that I would make the choice he'd already predicted. A brief walk would be fine, I said, rising before Christian could protest further. 10 minutes. Eric's smile was victory wrapped in courtesy. 10 minutes. I promised to return her intact, brother. The garden was cold, October air cutting through my dress as we walked down a gravel path lined with late-season roses. Eric had grabbed a wool coat from somewhere. His, I assumed from the way it settled perfectly across his broad shoulders, and draped it over mine without asking, the gesture both chivalrous and possessive. You wanted to discuss my work? I asked, proud of how level my voice sounded despite my racing heart. No. He stopped walking, turning to face me in the dim light from the distant house. I wanted to see if you'd come when I asked, if you'd choose truth over performance. Truth? That what happened Saturday wasn't a mistake. He moved closer, not touching, but near enough that I could smell sandalwood and feel the heat radiating from him despite the cold. You reached for me because some part of you recognized what your rational mind doesn't want to acknowledge. Which is? My voice came out breathless, betraying me. That you're with the wrong brother. His hand came up, not quite touching my face, but close enough that I felt the phantom warmth of his palm against my cheek. Christian is safe. Reasonable. The smart choice for a woman building a careful career. But he'll never see you, Astrid. Not really. He'll see a suitable companion who looks good at family dinners and doesn't ask inconvenient questions. And you see what, exactly? Someone who counts exits in every room, who catalogs power through leather portfolios and champagne glasses, who spent 3 years building armor so effective that she almost believes she's safe inside it. His dark eyes held mine. I see a woman who's terrified of wanting something unreasonable, something dangerous, something that might actually match the steel underneath all that professional composure. I should have stepped back, should have told him he was wrong, that he knew nothing about me, that his arrogance was matched only by his audacity in pursuing his brother's girlfriend. Instead, I stood frozen, my body responding to the challenge in his voice with heat that pooled low in my stomach. This is inappropriate, I managed. Yes. He smiled, dark and knowing. Inappropriate. Dangerous. Completely unreasonable. All the things you've spent years avoiding. And yet here you are, wearing my coat in a dark garden, not walking away. I should. You should. He echoed my words, still not touching, still maintaining that maddening distance that made me want to close it myself. But you won't. Because for all your careful choices and reasonable plans, something in you recognizes me. Recognizes this. This is nothing. I lied. This is you playing games because you're bored and I'm temporarily convenient. Is that what you think? For the first time, something that might have been genuine emotion flickered across his face. That this is a game? What else would it be? He stepped back then, giving me space I suddenly didn't want. Go back to Christian, Astrid. Enjoy your reasonable relationship with a safe brother. Build your careful life with someone who'll never push you, never challenge you, never make you question all those smart choices. I will. Good. But he was still smiling, that infuriating certainty back in his dark eyes. And I'll be here when you realize you're lying to yourself. When you finally acknowledge that safety isn't the same as satisfaction. When you're ready to stop settling for less than you deserve. I turned and walked back toward the house, leaving his coat behind on a garden bench, refusing to wear his warmth any longer. But even as I found Christian waiting anxiously in the foyer, even as we drove home in uncomfortable silence, I could feel Eric's presence like a brand between my shoulder blades. He was right about one thing. I was lying to myself. And the terrifying part was that I was starting to run out of lies that sounded convincing. 6 weeks after the garden conversation, I discovered exactly what kind of man Christian Wagner actually was, and exactly how wrong I'd been about safety versus danger. It started with the Schneider merger. The offshore transfers I'd flagged had turned into something bigger, requiring deeper investigation and additional documentation. Andreas had assigned me to coordinate directly with Schneider's legal team, which meant late nights at the office and detailed analysis that revealed an increasingly complex web of transactions. By mid-November, I'd identified a pattern that made my legal training set off every alarm. The transfers weren't just suspicious, they were structured to circumvent regulatory oversight, using shell companies and timing delays that suggested deliberate concealment. Not unusual for a merger this size, but enough to require disclosure to the acquiring company. I drafted a memo outlining the findings, recommending that we require Schneider to provide additional documentation before Morrison & Associates could sign off on the deal. Standard procedure, ethical obligation, the kind of work that separated legitimate firms from those that looked the other way. Christian read the memo in my apartment on a Tuesday night, his expression growing progressively darker as he scanned the pages. This could tank the entire merger, he said finally, setting the document down with careful precision. Billions of dollars, months of work, all because of some questionable transfers that probably have perfectly reasonable explanations. Then they can provide those explanations. I poured myself more wine, tired from another 14-hour day. Christian, this is my job. I can't sign off on something I know is problematic just because it's inconvenient. I understand that. He moved closer, his hand finding my waist. But before you submit this to Andreas, I'd like you to look at something else. Another angle that might give you more context. The something else arrived the next day. A set of documents from one of Christian's contacts. Detailed financial analysis that supposedly explained the offshore transfers as standard tax optimization strategies. Perfectly legal, just complex enough to look suspicious to someone without the full picture. I reviewed them carefully, my professional skepticism immediately identifying problems. The documentation was too neat, too perfectly aligned to counter my concerns, like it had been created specifically to provide cover rather than genuine explanation. Where did these come from? I asked Christian during lunch at an upscale restaurant he'd chosen specifically for its private booths. Schneider's team. They wanted to address your concerns directly. Why didn't they send them through official channels, through Andreas and the formal merger review process? Christian's smile was easy, charming, because going through official channels means delays and additional scrutiny. They're trying to expedite the process, Astrid. Help you see that your initial concerns were overblown. Something cold settled in my stomach. You're asking me to accept documentation that came outside proper channels and use it to withdraw my objections to the merger. I'm asking you to be reasonable about this. His hand covered mine on the table. You're brilliant, Astrid, but you're also young, still learning how things actually work in corporate law. Sometimes the right answer isn't the one that follows every single procedural rule. Sometimes it's about understanding context and bigger pictures. The bigger picture being that you want this merger to go through regardless of my ethical concerns. The bigger picture being that everyone benefits when deals close successfully. His thumb traced circles on my palm, a gesture that had once felt affectionate and now felt like manipulation. Including you. Morrison and Associates doesn't forget associates who help close major deals. That kind of success builds careers. I pulled my hand back, my mind racing through implications I'd been deliberately avoiding for months. How long have you known about the Schneider transfers? What? The offshore transactions, the pattern I flagged. How long have you known they were structured to avoid disclosure? Christian's expression shifted, the easy charm evaporating. Astrid, I don't know what you're... Yes, you do. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The acquisition that brought you to Morrison and Associates in the first place, the property deal I reviewed, that had similar patterns. I flagged them, and they mysteriously resolved before I could dig deeper. You made sure they resolved because you were already planning to use me as cover for deals that needed legal legitimacy without actual scrutiny. That's paranoid. Is it? I stood, needing distance from him in this booth and the sudden understanding that I'd been played for months. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you identified a talented junior associate with just enough ambition to be useful and not enough experience to recognize when she was being used. Sit down, Astrid. His voice went hard. You're making a scene. I'm leaving. I grabbed my coat, but Christian caught my wrist. If you submit that memo, you're making a mistake. Not a warning. A threat. Barely disguised. Morrison and Associates has very specific ideas about associates who create unnecessary complications for valuable clients. You could damage your entire career over ethical concerns that more experienced lawyers know how to navigate. I yanked my wrist free, fury replacing the cold shock. Let me be absolutely clear. I will submit my findings because that's my job. If Schneider's transfers are legitimate, they can prove it through proper channels. If they're not, then this merger deserves to fail. And if Morrison and Associates has a problem with me doing my job ethically, then I don't want to work there anyway. Christian's eyes went cold, all pretense of affection vanishing. You're making an enemy of the wrong family, Astrid. Then I'll take my chances. I walked out of the restaurant, shaking with adrenaline and fury, and the bitter understanding that Christian had never seen me as a partner or even a genuine romantic interest. I'd been a useful tool, nothing more. The memo went to Andreas that afternoon. By the next morning, the Schneider team had withdrawn their merger application entirely, citing unexpected complications that made the timing no longer viable. The deal collapsed, and with it, months of billable hours and partner bonuses that Morrison and Associates had been counting on. I expected consequences. Got them immediately. Friday afternoon, Andreas called me into his office with the careful expression of someone delivering bad news he agreed with but couldn't prevent. The partners have reviewed the Schneider situation, he said. Technically, you did everything correctly. Your analysis was thorough, your concerns were legitimate, and your ethical obligations were clear. But you also cost the firm millions in expected revenue and damaged our relationship with a valuable client family. He handed me a formal letter. The partners have decided it's best if we part ways. Effective immediately. You'll receive 3-month severance and excellent references for your work on other matters. Fired. For doing my job ethically. For refusing to be complicit in the kind of legal maneuvering that helped powerful people hide questionable transactions. I cleaned out my desk in numb silence, Karen hovering anxiously as I packed my few personal items into the same box I'd used when I moved in 18 months ago. This is wrong, she said, her voice shaking with anger. You did the right thing, Astrid. The partners are protecting their interests. I taped the box closed. Which is exactly what I'd expect. Christian Wagner carries more value than a junior associate with inconvenient ethics. What will you do? I honestly didn't know. My carefully constructed career path had just collapsed, and the relationship I'd invested 3 months in had been revealed as manipulation from the start. I was 24 years old, unemployed, and apparently naive enough to mistake calculated charm for genuine interest. Figure it out, I said with more confidence than I felt. I always do. But that night, alone in my apartment with job search websites open and my savings account looking distressingly finite, I let myself acknowledge the full scope of how thoroughly I'd been played. Christian had identified exactly what I wanted. Stability, career advancement, a relationship that looked like success. And he'd used those desires to make me complicit in ethical compromises I would have rejected from anyone else. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I heard about Morrison and Associates. Come to the address below tomorrow at 10 a.m. E.W. Eric. Of course Eric would know I'd been fired before I'd even told my closest friends. Of course he'd have my personal number despite me never giving it to him. Of course he'd reach out now, when I was vulnerable and angry and questioning every choice I'd made. I should delete the message, should block the number, should remember that Eric Wagner was dangerous in ways that made Christian's manipulation look like amateur hour. Instead, I stared at the address he'd sent. A building in the financial district I recognized as housing several high-end law firms, and felt something shift inside me. Christian had wanted me compliant and useful, had valued me only for what I could do to make his deals easier. But Eric had called me exceptional, had recognized the steel underneath, had challenged rather than diminished me. Maybe it was time to stop making safe choices. Maybe it was time to see what unreasonable looked like. At 9:45 the next morning, I stood outside the building Eric had specified, wearing my best interview suit and carrying a professional bag that contained copies of my resume, writing samples, and the stubborn determination that had gotten me through law school on scholarship and insurance money. The building's lobby was all marble and modern art, the kind of space that announced serious money without needing to explicitly state it. I checked the directory. Wagner and Hoffman Legal Associates, 15th floor. Eric had his own law firm, Of course he did. The elevator ride up felt endless. When the doors opened, I stepped into reception area that was understated elegance incarnate. Dark wood, leather furniture, windows overlooking the city. A receptionist who looked like she could double as a model smiled professionally. "Astrid Klein for Eric Wagner," I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "He's expecting you. This way." She led me down a corridor lined with what appeared to be original artwork, past several closed office doors, to a corner suite with Eric's name on a discreet brass plate. She knocked once, then opened the door. Eric stood by floor-to-ceiling windows, backlit by morning sun that made his white dress shirt, unbuttoned exactly 3 buttons as always, seemed to glow. He turned when I entered, and something in his expression made my breath catch. Not triumph, not the smugness I'd expected from a man who'd correctly predicted I'd come. Something softer, almost like relief. "Astrid." He dismissed the receptionist with a subtle gesture, waiting until we were alone before continuing. "Thank you for coming. I'm here to understand what this is." I gestured at the elegant office, the leather-bound law books, the practiced sophistication. "Not to accept whatever you think I need." "Fair enough." He moved away from the windows, settling into one of the chairs arranged for conversation rather than behind his desk. An equalizing choice. What this is: a legitimate law firm that handles complex corporate transactions for clients who value discretion. What I think you need: a position that values your talent for analysis and your unwillingness to compromise ethics for convenience. I'm supposed to believe you have ethical boundaries? The words came out sharper than intended, my anger at Christian bleeding into how I was approaching Eric. You're supposed to believe I have clear boundaries that I don't pretend are something else. His dark eyes held mine steadily. Christian wanted you compliant. I want you exactly as you are, sharp, uncompromising, and too damn smart to be satisfied with being someone's pretty accessory. The assessment was accurate enough to sting. And in exchange for this position that values my sterling qualities, what exactly would you expect from me? Your professional expertise, your analytical skills, your willingness to tell me when you think I'm wrong. He paused. And your trust that I won't use you the way my brother did. Trust. I let the word hang between us. That's asking for a lot, given that you've spent the last 6 weeks demonstrating exactly how thoroughly you can manipulate situations to get what you want. I sent you a portfolio and asked you to walk in a garden. His voice carried the faintest edge of amusement. Hardly manipulation on the scale of constructing an entire relationship to compromise your professional ethics. Point to Eric. What happened to Christian after the Schneider deal collapsed? He's currently explaining to our father why his attempt to use a promising young attorney as cover for questionable transactions resulted in lost business and damaged relationships. Eric's smile was sharp. I imagine that conversation is going poorly. You got him in trouble. I simply ensured that accurate information about his methods reached the appropriate ears. What our father chooses to do with that information is entirely his decision. Justice through family politics. I should have found it distasteful. Instead, I felt a dark satisfaction that Christian was facing consequences for treating me as expendable. The position, I said, forcing myself to focus on practical considerations. What would it actually entail? Corporate transactions for clients who need creative but legal solutions to complex problems. Contract review and negotiation. Occasional litigation support when deals go wrong. He leaned forward slightly. No offshore shell games, no regulatory circumvention, no asking you to look the other way. Just sophisticated legal work that requires someone smart enough to find legitimate paths through complicated situations. And if I find something I consider unethical, then you tell me, and we address it. I don't need an attorney who rubber stamps everything, Astrid. I need someone whose judgment I can trust, even and especially when that judgment contradicts what I want to hear. The offer was almost exactly what I'd wanted when I'd started at Morrison & Associates. Challenging work, real responsibility, a position that valued competence over compliance. Except this time, it came from a man I was attracted to in ways that made Christian's calculated charm look like pale imitation. "I can't work for you," I said finally. "Not like this. Not with whatever this tension is between us unresolved." "Then let's resolve it." Eric stood, moving to his desk and pulling out a document. "Hypothetically speaking, if the tension between us wasn't a factor, would you want this position? Would it represent the kind of legal career you actually aspire to?" I considered the question honestly, setting aside my awareness of his presence and the heat that curled low in my stomach every time he looked at me with those dark, intense eyes. Yes. Hypothetically, this would be exactly the kind of work I want to do. Good. He set the document on the coffee table between us. "Then, here's my proposal. You work for me on a trial basis. 3 months. Separate office, professional boundaries, no personal complications. At the end of 3 months, if you're satisfied with the work and my conduct, you make a permanent decision. If not, I provide excellent references and help you find a position elsewhere." "And the tension?" "Remains unresolved until you decide you want to resolve it, on your terms, in your timing." His expression was serious, none of the usual arrogant certainty. "I'm not Christian, Astrid. I don't need to manipulate you into wanting me. Either you eventually will or you won't. Either way, you'll still be an exceptional attorney who deserves better than what you've been offered so far." I picked up the document, an employment contract with Wagner and Hoffman Legal Associates. The salary was nearly double what I'd been making at Morrison & Associates. The benefits were comprehensive. The specific duties listed matched exactly what Eric had described. 3 months, I said slowly. Professional boundaries. And if at any point I feel uncomfortable with anything, work-related or otherwise, I can walk away with no consequences. You have my word. A dangerous man's word. But looking into those dark eyes, I believed him in a way I'd never quite believed Christian's easy promises. "I'll need to review this contract thoroughly before I sign anything. I'd be disappointed if you didn't." His smile was genuine, warm. "Take the weekend. Come back Monday with questions, concerns, or a signed contract, depending on your assessment." I gathered my things, tucking the contract into my professional bag alongside the resume I wouldn't need. At the door, I paused. "Eric, why are you doing this? And don't tell me it's just because I'm exceptionally talented. You could hire any number of exceptionally talented attorneys who don't come with complications." True. He stood by the windows again, silhouetted against the city skyline. But none of them make me want to be better than I am. None of them challenge me with every conversation. And none of them touched my shoulder on a dance floor and changed everything I thought I wanted. The honesty in those words undid something in my chest. I was reaching for Christian. No. His dark eyes held mine across the office. "You were reaching for me. You just didn't know it yet." I left before I could respond, before I could acknowledge how right he was. 3 days later, I signed the contract and started my new position at Wagner and Hoffman Legal Associates. Professional boundaries firmly in place. Attraction acknowledged but unacted upon. Working for a man who saw my steel and valued it rather than trying to disguise it as something softer and more manageable. It should have been simple. It should have stayed professional. But 6 months of working side by side with Eric Wagner taught me exactly how impossible it was to keep wanting something unreasonable from transforming into needing something essential. And when Christian's jealous retaliation finally came, it was Eric I trusted to protect me. Even knowing that protection would come with a price, I was no longer sure I wanted to avoid paying. 6 months into working at Wagner and Hoffman Legal Associates, I'd learned several important things about Eric Wagner. He was brilliant in ways that made contract negotiation feel like chess played at expert level. He demanded excellence, but provided the resources and support to achieve it. He never asked me to compromise my ethics, and the few times I'd flagged concerns, he'd listened and adjusted course. And he wanted me with an intensity that made our professional boundaries feel increasingly like a flimsy barrier against inevitable collapse. May brought unseasonable heat to the city. I'd been handling a complex acquisition for one of our international clients, working late most evenings to coordinate across time zones. Eric often stayed late too, our offices on the same floor, meaning we'd occasionally cross paths in the kitchenette or exchange brief conversations about case strategy. Tonight, I'd been reviewing contracts until nearly 9, my eyes burning from screen fatigue and my shoulders tight with tension. The office was quiet, most of the staff having left hours ago. I packed up my laptop, ready to face the late subway ride home, when Eric appeared in my doorway. "Working late again?" he observed. "Not a question. International clients require international hours." I slipped my laptop into my bag, acutely conscious of how his white dress shirt, 3 buttons undone, sleeves rolled to his elbows, made him look less like a corporate attorney and more like something dangerous pretending at civilization. "I'm ordering dinner. Join me." Again, not quite a question, but his tone suggested he'd accept refusal. I should have refused. Should have maintained the professional distance we'd carefully constructed over the last 6 months. But I was hungry, tired, and honestly craving his company in ways that went beyond collegial appreciation. "What are you ordering?" "Italian. There's a place in Little Italy that delivers even this late. The owner owes me a favor." Of course he did. Eric's network of people who owed him favors was extensive and slightly terrifying in its reach. We ate in his office, sitting at the conversation area rather than his desk, maintaining the professional pretense even as the late hour and shared meal made it feel increasingly personal. The food was exceptional, handmade pasta, the kind that required hours of careful preparation, served in containers that suggested the restaurant had packed it like they were feeding someone important. "Tell me about the Kozlov acquisition," Eric said, twirling pasta with practiced ease. "Are they being honest about their compliance history?" I'd been handling the Kozlov deal for 3 months, a Russian tech company wanting to establish U.S. operations through acquisition of a smaller domestic firm. The compliance review had been complex, requiring careful analysis of international regulations. "Mostly honest," I said. "There are some gray areas in how they've handled data privacy in Eastern European markets, but nothing that would prevent U.S. operations if they implement the structural changes I've recommended. And you trust your recommendations will be followed. I built compliance checkpoints into the contract milestones. If they don't implement changes, the deal doesn't proceed." I met his dark eyes across the coffee table. "No gray areas, no looking the other way. Exactly how you taught me to structure these things." Something shifted in his expression. Pride, maybe, or satisfaction. "You've learned quickly." I had a good teacher who actually wanted me to succeed, rather than just be useful. The reference to Christian hung in the air between us. We rarely mentioned Eric's brother anymore. Christian had been reassigned to less visible roles within the family business after the Schneider disaster, effectively sidelined from major decision-making. I sometimes wondered if Eric had orchestrated that too, but I'd learned not to ask questions about Wagner family politics. "Astrid." Eric set down his fork, his attention fully focused on me. "Your trial period ended 2 months ago. You chose to stay. Why?" The direct question deserved an honest answer. "Because this is the best professional opportunity I've ever had. Because I'm doing work that matters and challenges me. Because you've kept every promise you made about boundaries and ethics and trust." And the tension? There it was, the thing we'd been dancing around for 6 months. Acknowledged, but unaddressed. Still there, I admitted. Still complicated. It doesn't have to be. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, close enough that I could smell sandalwood and something uniquely him. I told you once that I'd wait until you decided you wanted to resolve it. I'm still waiting, Bella. But I want you to know. The waiting isn't passive patience. It's active restraint. Every day in this office, every late night, every moment you smile at something I've said, I'm choosing not to cross lines we both know exist. My heart hammered against my ribs. Why tell me this now? Because 6 months ago, you needed space to rebuild trust in your own judgment after Christian broke it. You needed to prove to yourself that you could work with me without it being about attraction or manipulation, or any of the games he played. His dark eyes held mine. But you've proven that, Astrid. You're here because you're exceptionally talented, and this work fulfills you. The attraction is separate. It exists, but it doesn't define why you stay. And if I told you I wanted to keep things professional, that I don't want to complicate a good working relationship with personal involvement, then we'd continue exactly as we have been. Professional boundaries, collegial respect, and I'd find a way to manage wanting you that doesn't make your professional life uncomfortable. He paused. But I don't think that's what you want. You're very certain about what I want. I'm certain about what I observe. The way you lean forward when we're discussing case strategy. How your pupils dilate when I'm close. The fact that you volunteered to handle the Kozlov deal specifically because it meant working late when I'm here. His smile was knowing. You want me too, Astrid. You're just afraid of wanting something that feels dangerous. He wasn't wrong. 6 months of proximity had transformed initial attraction into something deeper, more complicated. I'd learned Eric's patterns, how he thought through problems, the precise way he crafted arguments, the rare moments when his controlled facade cracked to reveal the intensity underneath. And I'd stopped pretending I didn't want to know what that intensity would feel like, directed entirely at me. It would be dangerous, I said quietly. You're dangerous, Eric, in ways that make Christian's manipulation look like child's play. Yes, no denial, no softening. I'm dangerous because I play for keeps, because I don't do things halfway, because when I decide I want something, I'm relentless about achieving it. But I'm also honest about who I am. I won't pretend to be safe or reasonable or any of the things you thought you wanted before you realized those things weren't actually satisfying. And what happens when you decide you don't want me anymore? When the conquest is complete and the novelty wears off? The question had been gnawing at me for months. Eric Wagner could have anyone. Beautiful, sophisticated, from his world in ways I wasn't. What happened when he got bored with the junior associate who'd challenged him briefly before inevitably falling into his orbit like everyone else? Eric stood, moving to the windows that overlooked the city lights. Do you know what I see when I look at you? He didn't wait for my answer. Someone who rebuilt her entire career after being betrayed, who took a risk on working for me when conventional wisdom said that was insane, who calls me on my bullshit in contract negotiations and refuses to back down when I push back, who's brilliant enough to run intellectual circles around most attorneys twice her age, but humble enough to keep learning. He turned to face me. That's not novelty, Astrid. That's partnership. The kind that doesn't wear off because it's built on mutual respect rather than just attraction. Yes, I want you physically. Have since the moment you touched my shoulder thinking I was Christian. But I also want your mind, your ethics, your sharp observations about power structures. I want the whole complicated, exceptional package. I stood too, needing to be on equal footing for this conversation. If we do this, if I stop fighting this attraction, everything changes. Our professional relationship, our power dynamic, the way people see us working together. Yes. I could lose credibility I've been rebuilding. People might think I slept my way into this position. They might. Until they work with you, and realize you're here because you're exceptional at what you do. He moved closer, still not touching. But I won't lie and say there won't be complications. My world is complicated, Astrid. My family's business has aspects you've carefully avoided examining too closely. Dating me means accepting that you'll see things that challenge your neat categories of legal and illegal. Are you asking me to compromise my ethics again? No. His voice was firm. I'm asking you to trust that I won't put you in situations that require you to compromise. You'll see the gray areas of what I do, yes, but I'll never ask you to be complicit in anything that crosses your lines. You've proven those lines are non-negotiable. I respect that. The honesty was both reassuring and terrifying. Eric was offering me exactly what I'd claimed to want since that first night at the Wagner birthday celebration. Recognition of my competence, respect for my ethics, a partnership that didn't require me to diminish myself. The fact that it also came with heat and intensity, and the promise of something that would absolutely be dangerous was just part of the package. I don't know how to do this, I admitted. I don't know how to be with someone like you without losing myself. Then we figure it out together. He finally closed the distance, his hand coming up to cup my face with devastating gentleness. I'm not asking for capitulation, Bella. I'm asking for partnership. You keep your steel, your ethics, your brilliant mind. I get to be the person who appreciates all of it, instead of trying to soften it into something more manageable. His thumb traced my cheekbone, and I felt myself leaning into the touch, despite every rational objection. This was Eric Wagner, dangerous and powerful and absolutely not safe. This was my boss, complicating an already complex professional relationship. This was everything I should be running from. But his dark eyes held mine with an intensity that made my breath catch, and I realized something fundamental. I was tired of running, tired of choosing safe over satisfying, tired of pretending I didn't want exactly this. Him, complicated and dangerous and honest about all of it. One condition, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Name it. If this doesn't work, if the personal relationship fails, I keep my position here. You don't make me leave. Don't make staying unbearable. I've rebuilt my career once. I won't do it again because we couldn't navigate a breakup professionally. Agreed. No hesitation. Though I should warn you, I don't plan on this failing. When I decide I want something long-term, I'm very good at making it work. Arrogant. Confident. His smile was dark and knowing. There's a difference. I rose on my toes, closing the final inches between us, and kissed him. Not tentatively, not questioning, but with the same decisiveness I brought to every other important choice. If I was going to do this, I was going to commit fully. Eric responded immediately, his hand sliding into my hair as he deepened the kiss with an intensity that made my knees weak. This wasn't the practiced charm Christian had offered. This was raw and demanding and absolutely mutual. Two people who'd been circling each other for months, finally allowing the attraction to become action. When we broke apart, both breathing hard, Eric rested his forehead against mine. Dinner tomorrow night, he said, voice rough. Somewhere that's not this office. A real date, Astrid. Let me do this properly. Properly? I couldn't help but laugh. We've been working together for 6 months. I think we're past properly. Humor me. I want to take you somewhere beautiful, buy you dinner that costs too much, and pretend this started conventionally instead of with you mistaking me for my brother at a family party. The reference to that night, to the beginning of all this complication, made something warm settle in my chest. Fine, but I'm picking the restaurant. I have standards about overpriced food. Of course you do. He kissed me again. Softer this time. That's exactly why this is going to work, Bella. You won't let me get away with anything. He was right. Whatever this relationship became, it wouldn't be me diminishing myself to fit his world. It would be me staying exactly as I was, sharp, ethical, uncompromising, while Eric figured out how to integrate someone like that into his complicated life. It should have been impossible. But as we finished our dinner and talked late into the night about everything except work, I started believing that maybe impossible was just another word for challenges we hadn't solved yet. And if there was one thing Eric and I were both excellent at, it was solving complex problems others considered unsolvable. 3 months into officially dating Eric Wagner, I learned exactly how extensive his empire actually was, and how thoroughly his family's business had woven itself into every aspect of the city's commercial life. It started with small observations. How vendors at the upscale restaurants we frequented would materialize with our preferred table despite no reservation. How permits for our clients' development sailed through bureaucratic processes that normally took months. How competing bids on major contracts somehow always fell just short of the proposals Eric supported. I'd spent 6 months working for Wagner and Hoffman, deliberately not examining too closely the mechanisms behind our success. Professional willful ignorance. But dating Eric meant those mechanisms became increasingly impossible to ignore. We were having dinner at his penthouse, a space I'd been visiting regularly since we'd started this relationship officially. The view from the 42nd floor was stunning, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city lights spread below like scattered diamonds. Eric had cooked, surprising me with both his competence and the casual domesticity of him moving around the kitchen in jeans and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. "The Kozlov acquisition closed today," he said, refilling my wine glass with something that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to. "Your compliance framework worked perfectly. They're already implementing the structural changes you recommended." Good. I'd been monitoring the Kozlov deal closely, wanting to ensure my recommendations were actually followed. Their general counsel called this afternoon to thank me specifically for the clear guidance. Apparently, most attorneys just tell them what won't work without offering viable alternatives. That's because most attorneys think in terms of obstacles rather than solutions. Eric settled beside me on the leather sofa, his arm draping casually around my shoulders. "You think in terms of how to achieve legitimate goals through proper channels. It's rare. It's basic professional ethics. In theory." His smile was sardonic. "In practice, you'd be surprised how many attorneys view ethics as suggestions rather than requirements." I thought about Morrison and Associates, about Christian's casual assumption that I'd compromise my standards for convenience. Not that surprised, actually. We ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the kind of easy companionship that had developed surprisingly quickly. Eric was intense in professional settings, all controlled power and strategic thinking. But in private, he relaxed in ways that revealed someone more complex than the dangerous reputation suggested. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, setting down his fork. "About the family business. Things you've been deliberately not asking about." My stomach tightened. "Eric, I told you. I don't need to know details about aspects that might compromise my legal position. What I don't know, I can't be forced to testify about. I'm not asking you to be complicit." His dark eyes were serious. "But I want you to understand what you're choosing to be part of. Full disclosure, Astrid. Then you decide if you can live with it." Part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain the comfortable ignorance that let me sleep at night. But I'd built this relationship on honesty and mutual respect. If Eric was offering truth, I owed it to both of us to hear it. "Okay," I said quietly. "Tell me." What he revealed over the next hour was both better and worse than I'd imagined. The Wagner family had built their empire through a combination of legitimate business acumen and strategic leverage. They didn't run drugs or engage in violence. But they absolutely used information, connections, and carefully applied pressure to ensure favorable outcomes for their interests. "Think of it as aggressive capitalism," Eric explained. "We identify what people need, permits, financing, political support, and we provide it. In exchange, They provide future considerations, votes on zoning boards, priority processing for our projects, favorable terms on contracts. Nothing explicitly illegal, but everything dancing along the edges of what's acceptable. It's corruption, I said flatly. Sophisticated, plausibly deniable corruption, but corruption nonetheless. Yes, no denial, no softening. My father built this network over 40 years. I inherited it, refined it, made it more subtle and harder to prosecute. We've never been charged with anything, because we're very good at operating within technical legality, while achieving outcomes that circumvent the spirit of the law. I processed this, my legal training automatically cataloging the implications. And Wagner and Hoffman Legal Associates legitimately helps clients navigate complex regulations. You've seen our work, Astrid. We don't fabricate compliance. We find legal paths through complicated situations. The fact that those paths are sometimes easier because of family connections is separate from the legal services we provide. That's sophistry. You're benefiting from a corrupt system even if the individual legal work is clean. Yes. He took my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. I won't pretend otherwise, but I will tell you this. Since you've been here, I've started questioning how much of this I actually want to maintain. The network, the leverage, the endless careful manipulation of systems designed to be fair. It's exhausting, Astrid, and increasingly unsatisfying. Why tell me this now? Because I love you. The words were simple, direct, devastating in their certainty. And because you deserve to make an informed choice about whether you can build a life with someone whose empire is built on morally gray foundations, even if those foundations are technically legal. I love you. He loved me. Eric Wagner, dangerous and powerful and honest about every complicated aspect of who he was, loved me. I don't know what to do with that information, I managed, my voice unsteady. You don't have to do anything immediately. His hand tightened on mine. Think about it. Decide if you can live with loving someone whose methods you find ethically problematic. I won't be offended if the answer is no. Disappointed, heartbroken even, but not offended. You've always been honest about your principles. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not the dangerous Mafia heir from reputation, but the man who'd spent 6 months proving he respected my competence, who'd cooked me dinner and asked about my day, and challenged me intellectually in ways that made me sharper, who was offering me complete honesty even knowing it might destroy what we'd built. I love you too, I heard myself say, which is possibly the stupidest thing I've ever admitted given what you just told me about your business practices. His smile was relieved, genuine. Love has never been accused of being particularly rational. No. I laughed despite the weight of everything he'd revealed. But I need to think about the rest. About whether I can be with someone whose empire I find ethically problematic, even if I love the person at the center of that empire. Fair enough. He pulled me closer, and I let myself rest against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. We sat like that for a long time. The city lights spread below us, and I tried to reconcile the man I loved with the methods he employed to maintain power. It should have been impossible. Probably was impossible for anyone with consistent ethical standards. But I'd also learned over the last 9 months that moral absolutism was a luxury afforded to people who didn't live in complicated realities. Eric's world was complicated, and maybe, I could be the person who helped make it less corrupt over time rather than just condemning it from outside. The decision crystallized over the next few weeks. I'd continue working at Wagner and Hoffman, continue building my career doing legitimate legal work, continue loving Eric while actively working to reduce the empire's dependence on corrupt leverage. It was compromise, yes, but it was strategic compromise with clear ethical boundaries and long-term goals. The kind of moral complexity I'd been avoiding my entire professional life. Turned out loving Eric Wagner meant accepting that sometimes the right answer wasn't pure or simple. Sometimes it was messy and complicated, and required constantly reassessing where lines should be drawn. But it also meant partnership with someone who saw my steel and valued it, who challenged me intellectually, who was willing to change foundational business practices, because I asked him to consider different approaches. 3 months into that decision, Christian made his move. I was leaving the office late when he appeared in the parking garage, my first encounter with him since the Schneider disaster nearly a year ago. He looked thinner, harder, the easy charm replaced by something bitter. Astrid. He blocked my path to my car. We need to talk. We don't. I reached for my keys, my legal training assessing exits and options. Whatever you think you need to say, I'm not interested in hearing it. You're sleeping with my brother. Not a question. His voice carried venom I'd never heard when we were together. Destroyed my career, took my position at the firm, and now you're fucking Eric while pretending you have ethical standards. Move, Christian. I kept my voice level despite my racing heart. We're done. We've been done for a year. What I do with my personal life is no longer your concern. It became my concern when you started using family connections to advance your career, when you became part of Eric's corruption while judging me for small-time manipulation. He moved closer, and I smelled alcohol on his breath. You're a hypocrite, Astrid. At least I was honest about using you. Eric's just better at dressing it up as respect. The words stung because they contained grains of truth I'd been struggling with for months. But they were also the frustrated attacks of a man who'd lost power and was lashing out. I'm calling security, I said, pulling out my phone. Leave now or I'll have you removed. He grabbed my wrist. Not hard, but enough to stop me from dialing. This isn't over. You think Eric's protection extends forever? You think there won't be consequences for everything you've taken from me? A voice from the shadows made us both freeze. Let her go, Christian. Eric emerged from between parked cars, his presence filling the garage despite casual clothing. Now. Christian released me immediately, taking several steps back. The fear in his eyes was primal, genuine. Whatever threat Eric represented to his younger brother, it was significant enough to override alcohol and bitterness. She's poison, brother, Christian said, his voice shaking. She'll destroy you like she destroyed me. Astrid didn't destroy you. Eric's voice was flat, dangerous. You destroyed yourself by being too short-sighted to recognize her value beyond usefulness. Now leave before I decide this parking garage conversation needs to become something more official. Christian fled. Actually fled, nearly running to his car and peeling out of the garage with enough speed to leave rubber on the concrete. I sagged against my car, adrenaline flooding my system now that the immediate threat was gone. How long were you watching? I asked. Long enough to know he was waiting for you. Long enough to let you handle it before I intervened. Eric came closer, his hands gentle as they checked my wrist where Christian had grabbed. He's been making threats about you for weeks. I've been monitoring his movements. You could have warned me. I could have. But you needed to see for yourself that Christian hasn't changed. That his bitterness is about ego, not genuine feeling. His dark eyes held mine. And I needed to know you'd handle the confrontation with the strength I know you have rather than doubting yourself. The manipulation should have angered me. Instead, I recognized it for what it was. Eric's version of trust. He'd protected me while letting me prove I could handle threats myself. He's dangerous now, I said. Not physically, but he has connections, family resentments, motivation to cause problems. Yes. Eric's smile was sharp, predatory. Which is why I've already implemented solutions. Christian will find his influence in family business significantly reduced over the coming months. His ability to cause problems for you specifically will be curtailed. I should have asked what solutions meant. Should have established exactly what methods Eric intended to use. But standing in that parking garage, still shaking from confrontation with a man who'd used me and now threatened retaliation, I found I didn't care about the specific mechanisms of Christian's diminishment. I just wanted him gone from my life. Wanted the chapter he represented: naive trust, professional vulnerability, romantic manipulation, closed permanently. Make him go away, I said quietly. Not physically, just make him understand that targeting me brings consequences he can't afford. Already done, Bella. Eric pulled me close, and I let myself rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady against my cheek. You're mine to protect now. Anyone who threatens you deals with me. That's not negotiable. The possessiveness in those words should have triggered my independence. Instead, they felt like safety, like someone finally having my back without expecting me to diminish myself in exchange. 2 weeks later, Christian Wagner quietly left the city, accepting a position with the family's European operations that was technically a promotion, but practically an exile. Eric never explained exactly what leverage had been applied. I never asked. What mattered was that the threat was neutralized, and I was free to continue building my career and relationship without looking over my shoulder for bitter retaliation. What mattered was that Eric had protected me while respecting my capability to handle direct confrontation myself. What mattered was that I'd chosen this complicated, ethically ambiguous partnership with full knowledge of what it meant, and I was choosing it again every day. The web had closed around me, yes, but I was discovering that being caught in Eric's web meant being seen, protected, and valued in ways I'd never experienced. And if that meant living with moral complexity? I was starting to think the benefits outweighed the philosophical concerns. 10 months into our relationship, on a crisp March evening, everything changed. I was at Eric's penthouse, having moved in 3 months prior after my lease ended, and the pretense of maintaining separate residences had become obviously pointless. We'd fallen into comfortable domesticity, me working on case files at the dining table, him reviewing contracts from the sofa, Chinese takeout containers scattered between us. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost declined, but something made me answer. Ms. Klein? A woman's voice, professional but urgent. This is Detective Karen Schmidt from the Financial Crimes Division. We need to speak with you about your employment at Wagner and Hoffman Legal Associates. Ice flooded my veins. Karen Schmidt, my former colleague from Morrison and Associates who'd become a friend. Except this wasn't my friend calling. This was law enforcement. I think you have the wrong person, I said carefully, every instinct from my legal training activating. My friend Karen works in private practice, not law enforcement. Your friend Karen is actually Detective Schmidt, the voice said. She's been undercover at Morrison and Associates for the last 3 years, investigating potential connections between legitimate law firms and organized crime networks. You were never a target, Ms. Klein, but your current employer is. The room tilted. Karen, my friend, my confidant, the person I'd trusted with details about Christian, about Eric, about my ethical struggles with Wagner family business practices, had been law enforcement all along. I'm hanging up now, I managed. If you want to speak with me, contact me through proper legal channels. Ms. Klein, wait. You're not in trouble. We know you left Morrison and Associates on ethical grounds. We know you've been working legitimately at Wagner and Hoffman. But we have evidence that Eric Wagner has been using the firm to launder money for family operations, and we believe you may have unknowingly processed transactions related to criminal enterprise. We need your cooperation. I ended the call, my hands shaking. Eric had looked up from his contracts, his expression shifting from concern to calculating as he assessed my reaction. What happened? I told him. Every word. The call, the revelation about Karen, the accusations about money laundering, the request for cooperation. He listened without interrupting, his face going progressively harder. "They're fishing," he said finally, "looking for leverage to pressure you into testifying against me. The call wasn't official because they don't actually have evidence. They're hoping you'll panic and volunteer information." "Is it true?" The question came out small, frightened. "The money laundering. Define laundering." He stood, moving to the windows that overlooked the city. "Every transaction we process is documented. Every client payment is legitimate compensation for legal services. If some of those clients are using our services as part of broader financial strategies that move money between legitimate and less legitimate sources, that's not something I can control." "That's lawyer speak, Eric. Yes or no? Are we laundering money?" He turned to face me. "We are providing legal services to clients whose business practices include complex financial structures. Some of those structures exist to avoid taxes legally. Some exist to move money between enterprises in ways that obscure origins. We do the legal work. What clients do with that work is beyond our ethical obligation to monitor." "That's still yes. It's complicated, yes." He crossed to where I sat, kneeling so we were eye level. "Astrid, I've never asked you to sign off on anything illegal. Every contract you've reviewed, every transaction you've processed, has been legitimate on its face. If law enforcement wants to make the case that the aggregate effect is money laundering, that's a complex legal argument that would require proving intent to conceal criminal proceeds. Intent they can't prove, because it doesn't exist in the work you've done. But it exists in the work the firm does collectively." "Possibly. Probably." He took my hands. "But you're insulated from that. You do clean legal work for clients who may or may not have dirty money somewhere in their financial ecosystem. That doesn't make you complicit." I wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that I'd maintained ethical boundaries even while working in Eric's morally gray world. But the fact that law enforcement was investigating, that my friend had been undercover for years, suggested the situation was more serious than Eric was acknowledging. "I need to think," I said. "I need to figure out what this means for my career, for my legal obligations, for everything." "Of course." He stood, giving me space. "But Astrid, whatever you decide, know this. I love you. That's not contingent on your cooperation or silence or anything else. If you need to walk away from Wagner and Hoffman to protect your career, I'll help you find another position. If you need to cooperate with law enforcement to clear your name, I won't hold it against you. Your well-being comes first." The words should have been comforting. Instead, they highlighted exactly how impossible this situation was. If I cooperated with law enforcement, I'd be betraying the man I loved. If I refused to cooperate, I'd be potentially obstructing justice. There was no clean choice, no ethically pure path forward. Over the next week, I consulted with Andreas Becker, my former mentor from Morrison & Associates, who'd left the firm around the same time I'd been fired. He'd built a successful practice representing whistleblowers and employees caught in corporate misconduct. "The fact that they haven't officially contacted you yet suggests they're still building their case," he explained over coffee at a cafe far from both Wagner and Hoffman and any Wagner family properties. "They're hoping you'll voluntarily cooperate before they have enough evidence to compel testimony." "What should I do?" "Legally? Nothing. You haven't been served with a subpoena. You haven't been accused of anything. Until they make an official move, you have no obligation to respond to fishing expeditions." "And morally?" He studied me carefully. "That's a different question. Do you believe Wagner and Hoffman is knowingly participating in money laundering?" I thought about the last 10 months of work. The clients I'd served, the contracts I'd reviewed, the transactions I'd processed. Had there been red flags I'd ignored? Patterns I'd deliberately not examined too closely? "I believe we provide legal services to clients with complex financial situations," I said slowly. "Whether those situations cross into criminal territory isn't something I'm positioned to assess without much deeper investigation." which is exactly what law enforcement wants you to do. Turn investigator against your employer. Andreas leaned forward. Astrid, you're in an impossible position. Eric Wagner is your boss and your partner. Cooperating with law enforcement means destroying both relationships. But refusing to cooperate could mean becoming complicit in covering up financial crimes. What would you do? I'd ask myself, what can I live with? Can you live with potentially helping conceal criminal activity because you love the person who might be committing it? Or can you live with betraying someone you love in service of abstract legal principles? The question haunted me for days. Eric gave me space, didn't pressure, didn't try to influence my decision. But I felt his worry in the careful way he watched me, in the gentle touches that said, I'm here when you're ready. 2 weeks after the initial call, I made my decision. I invited Karen, Detective Schmidt, to meet me at a neutral location. She came alone, looking exactly like the friend I'd known, except now I could see the law enforcement training and how she assessed the coffee shop's exits, how she positioned herself with her back to the wall. Thank you for meeting me, she said, her German accent as familiar as ever. I know this is difficult. You lied to me for 3 years. I kept my voice level despite the betrayal burning in my chest. Everything we discussed, every confidence I shared, was intelligence gathering. Not everything. She had the grace to look uncomfortable. The friendship was real, Astrid. But yes, I was there to investigate Morrison and Associates' connections to organized crime networks. You weren't a target. You were someone I genuinely liked who kept getting tangled with the wrong men. Men you were investigating. Christian Wagner led us to Morrison and Associates. Eric Wagner led us to expand the investigation to Wagner and Hoffman. She pulled out a folder. I'm showing you this as a friend, not as law enforcement. You should know what you're protecting. The folder contained evidence of wire transfers, shell company structures, client lists that included names I recognized from news coverage of organized crime investigations. Not proof of illegal activity exactly, but patterns that suggested Wagner and Hoffman was providing sophisticated financial infrastructure for money laundering operations. Eric told me we provide legal services, I said. That what clients do with those services is beyond our ethical obligation. That's the defense his attorneys will use when we indict, and it might work for him. He's very good at maintaining plausible deniability. But Astrid, you're a brilliant attorney. You know the difference between genuinely not knowing and deliberately not looking. Which one have you been doing? The question cut, because it was exactly what I'd been asking myself. Had I genuinely not known? Or had I chosen comfortable ignorance because acknowledging the truth would require choosing between my career and the man I loved? What do you want from me? I asked. Testimony about the transactions you processed. Details about how Wagner and Hoffman structures client services. Evidence that Eric Wagner was directly involved in creating the financial infrastructure we believe is facilitating money laundering. She paused. In exchange, we offer complete immunity and help relocating you away from the Wagner family's influence. You want me to destroy the man I love and the career I've rebuilt. I want you to tell the truth about what you've witnessed. Whether that destroys anything depends on what that truth actually is. I stared at the folder, at the evidence of patterns I'd been deliberately not examining, at the proof that my comfortable moral compromise had been built on willful ignorance. I need to think about it. We can give you 1 week. After that, we'll proceed with the investigation with or without your cooperation. But Astrid, if you're not cooperating, we'll have to treat you as potentially complicit rather than an innocent witness. That's not a threat. It's just legal reality. I left the meeting and went directly to Eric's penthouse. He was waiting, having obviously known exactly where I'd been and why. She showed you evidence, he said. Not a question. She showed me patterns that suggest Wagner and Hoffman is facilitating money laundering. She wants my testimony in exchange for immunity. And you're considering it. I should be considering it. Legally, morally, that's the right choice. I moved to the windows, looking out at the city we both knew so well. But Eric, if I testify, I'll be destroying everything you've built, everything your family has constructed over generations. I'll be betraying you. He came to stand beside me, not touching, just present. You'd also be doing your legal duty, protecting yourself from criminal prosecution, choosing ethics over personal loyalty. Since when do you advocate for me betraying you? Since I realized that I love you more than I love my empire. His voice was quiet, certain. If testifying is what you need to do to protect your legal career and ethical standing, then do it, Astrid. I'll handle the consequences. You shouldn't have to compromise your principles because I've built my success on moral gray areas. The honesty of it, the genuine willingness to sacrifice his business for my ethical comfort, undid something in my chest. I can't, I heard myself say. I can't testify against you. Astrid, not because I'm choosing loyalty over ethics, because I genuinely don't know enough to testify meaningfully. I turned to face him. I've processed legitimate legal transactions, helped clients structure legitimate businesses. If those clients are using that infrastructure for money laundering, I didn't knowingly participate. And testifying to patterns I've deliberately not examined would be speculation, not evidence. Detective Schmidt will argue that's willful blindness. Maybe it is. Probably it is. I took his hands, feeling the strength in them. But I'm choosing to believe that doing clean legal work in a potentially compromised firm doesn't make me criminally complicit. And I'm choosing to trust that you'll dismantle whatever infrastructure is actually facilitating crimes before law enforcement can prove their case. You're asking me to change my entire business model. I'm asking you to become the legitimate legal firm we've been pretending to be. To cut ties with clients who are actually laundering money. To operate with genuine ethical boundaries instead of just technical legality. I held his gaze. Can you do that? For us? For a future that isn't constantly looking over our shoulder for investigations? He was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes searching mine. It would mean losing significant revenue, alienating family connections, rebuilding the firm from scratch with different client base. Yes. It would mean proving to you that I'm willing to change fundamental business practices because you've asked me to consider different approaches. Yes. It would mean choosing you and potential future over the empire my father built. Yes. His smile was slow, genuine. Then yes, I'll do it. We'll rebuild Wagner and Hoffman as genuinely legitimate operation. Cut the questionable clients. Implement real compliance structures, become the firm you've believed we could be. I kissed him then, relief and love and terror combining into something that felt like hope. Over the following months, Eric systematically dismantled the Wagner family's financial infrastructure. Not publicly, not in ways that would expose past wrongdoing, but decisively. Questionable clients were told their services were no longer available. Complex financial structures were simplified or dissolved. The firm's practices were restructured around genuine ethical compliance. It cost the family millions, created rifts between Eric and his father that would take years to repair, made enemies of associates who'd benefited from the old system. But it also created something new. A law firm that actually lived up to its stated principles. A business model that didn't require constant vigilance against investigation. A future where I could practice law without moral compromise. Detective Schmidt's investigation continued for another year, but without my testimony, and without current criminal activity to prosecute, the case gradually lost momentum. No charges were filed. The investigation quietly closed with a report suggesting past misconduct that couldn't be sufficiently proven. Eric and I married 2 years after that first dance, the one where I'd reached for the wrong brother and found the right man. Small ceremony, close friends only, no performance of family dynasty or social obligation. Just two people who'd chosen each other despite every rational objection, who'd rebuilt careers and businesses and moral frameworks to create something that worked despite being impossible. Just partnership built on honesty, even when honesty meant acknowledging uncomfortable truths. Just love that survived investigation and family rifts, and the constant tension between what was legally permissible and what was morally right. 3 years later, standing in the office of Wagner and Klein Legal Associates, Eric had insisted on the name change, said the firm needed to reflect partnership, not just his family legacy. I still sometimes wondered if I'd made the right choices. If refusing to testify had been ethical compromise or principled stand. If changing Eric's business model had been genuine reform or just sophisticated cover. If loving someone dangerous had made me complicit in dangers I'd convinced myself I could manage. But then Eric would appear in my office doorway, coffee in hand, and case law to discuss. And I'd remember why impossible had always been just another word for challenges we hadn't solved yet. We were solving them. Together. Imperfectly, sometimes uncomfortably, but honestly. And in the end, maybe that was what moral complexity actually meant. Not finding pure answers, but building partnerships that made better questions possible. The city spread below my windows, and I knew Eric was somewhere in this building doing the same work, defending clients' interests through legitimate means, building success without exploitation, proving that dangerous men could become better without losing the intensity that made them magnetic. Wrong brother, he'd said that first night, but he'd been right about so much else. And sometimes getting the wrong thing first was exactly what led you to figure out what right actually meant. Thank you for joining Astrid and Eric on this journey from a mistaken touch to a love that transformed everything. Their story reminds us that sometimes the wrong choice leads us exactly where we're meant to be, and that real partnership means accepting complexity without losing ourselves. If this story touched your heart, please click like to support more tales of strong women and the dangerous men who learn to deserve them. What would you do if you accidentally reached for the wrong brother at a party and discovered he was exactly the right man? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing your perspectives on these complicated romances.